Good afternoon. My name is Randy Kluver, and it's my pleasure to serve as the Associate Provost and Dean of the School of Global Studies and Partnerships at Oklahoma State University. Thank you for joining us for our first ever IPGS, or Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies Research Week at Oklahoma State. The IPGS program was established in 2016 with support from the Farzaneh Family Foundation to support academic research and education on Iran and the Persian Gulf region. The IPGS program at Oklahoma State draws upon the unique strengths of OSU as a land-grant university, exploring the technological, economic, and geographic challenges of this region. We're tremendously grateful for the Farzaneh family for their vision and commitment to helping the citizens of Oklahoma and the OSU community to understand this vital region. I would like to welcome our audience today and to wish you Happy Nowruz, as I have several times this week. Nowruz is the ancient Persian holiday acknowledging the end of winter and the first day of spring. Nowruz Mubarak, and thank you for joining us during this festive time. Our topic today is global trade relationships in the 21st century BC, the Gulf, Iraq, Iran, and beyond. That is BC, not AD. I know it's very confusing. It confused me at first. But we are fortunate to have an OSU faculty member to introduce us to this very interesting topic. Tonia Sharlach is professor in the Department of History at OSU. Her research interests include trade, religion, and other topics related to the ancient Near East. She received her BA from Cambridge University and her PhD in Assyriology from Harvard University. We're grateful for her role as a member of the Faculty Advisory Council for the IPGS program at OSU. Professor Sharlach will make a presentation for 30 minutes or so before we take questions. During the presentation, you'll see a phone number scroll across the screen. If you'd like to ask a question, you can text it to that number for her to address after the talk. Professor Sharlach, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, so I am going to hope that this is working and that you guys can see my PowerPoint. Right, so tonight we're going to be looking at the Bronze Age, namely a time about 4,000 years ago. And that may seem impossibly remote, but what I hope you'll see by the end of the evening is that many of the same needs and pressures for business people were operational back then, though of course they had different constraints in terms of slow transport, poor communication, and lack of a common currency. Of course, since coins hadn't been invented yet, finding a common means of exchange among nations could be a little complicated. The basic foundations of what is needed for successful global partnerships in business today seem also to have been operational back then. To trade, you had to have a good product as well as a way to move it around, and governments that were not hostile to one another. Traders had to be able to communicate with one another despite their various languages. Additionally, it was helpful to have friends or contacts and mutual trust built up over time. What was toxic for global partnerships and trade today is also toxic back then. A poor supply, a poor product, inability to communicate, hostility, excessive taxation, and unfriendly conditions. Another barrier to trade back then that is less common now is death of the trader while on the job. And unfortunately, this seems to have been pretty common as we find traders' burials all over the area. After a little bit of background so that we understand who these traders were, what was being traded, and how we know so much about it after so long, I'd like to focus on two basic arguments or postulates. Traders came from all over in crisscrossed land and water routes, but the really successful ones made it because of who they knew. Personal influence over city leaders, rulers, and their families granted access to some in ways others could not attain. And second, Trade was a key driver in ancient economies, as it is a driver in economies today. Taxes and tolls from trade were extremely important in filling the government's revenue needs. With these two postulates in mind, let's jump in and review the major trading lands. There were 4 superpowers in specifically the years from around 2150 to 2000 BC. There were 4 superpower civilizations, and Egypt, of course, was one of them. But Egypt essentially was keeping itself to itself, or when it trading down here in sub-Saharan Africa. So I fear we will have to set it aside for the purposes of today's lecture. The second superpower civilization is known to the Greeks as the land between the 2 rivers, the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates. So they called the land between the 2 rivers, Mesopotamia. Sometimes we call it Babylonia. It's more or less, at least the southern parts, in the nation state of Iraq today. That was the second superpower civilization. At this point, it was already a very, very, very ancient civilization, thousands of years old. And their political form constantly shifted between individual city-states that competed with one another, and then brief moments when they did join together as one country with one capital and one king. In the 21st century BC, they were in one of those unified stages with a dynasty based at the seaport of Ur, which you see right here. Now, you may notice the sort of bright green here is an indication that the head of the Gulf came up significantly further to the north, so that Ur was in fact on the sea at that time, although of course it is not today. Part of the habit of the time was to write everything down, sometimes in duplicate. And this is one of their tablets here. We call their form of writing cuneiform or wedge or nail-shaped writing, and it can be used to really essentially write every language in the world. But in this case, it is used to write the Sumerian language. So this is a tablet from Iraq written in cuneiform from the 21st century BC in Sumerian. We have about 95,000 of these documents, these administrative cuneiform clay tablets from the 21st century alone, from a period of about only 50 years, which is really quite an extraordinary richness of historical data. And this is the reason that we can know so much about these trade partnerships. Actually, we're not even done at 95,000. Many more unpublished tablets await us in various museum shelves, and many, many more are still in the ground. These tablets, such as this one, tend to record financial and accounting matters, and they are certainly our best source for learning about trade. Reading them is how I spend a lot of my days. The third superpower, of course, is Iran, located here. There are various important polities here. The important city of Susa, the area of Elam, which we see here. This is largely the Khuzestan province of Iran today, as well as Anshan, a very, very important capital, a land named Marhashi that everybody now has forgotten about, but which was really, really critical, and a place called Shimashki, much further into the plain. Now in Iran, they could use the same script, cuneiform, as we see on this silver vessel, to write their own languages. This is an inscription of an Elamite king. And they had their own language, Elamite. Now, the reason that we're not really using Elamite sources to reconstruct the history of this period has nothing to do with the importance of the land, which was great, but simply that we have very, very, very few Elamite tablets, and Elamite is not like remarkably well understood. Archaeological investigations in Iran have come about largely recently. We see here the site of Konar Sandal, found in a flood only about 20 years ago. And one of their most important trade products was this sort of shiny grayish black stone, which we call chlorite. So many really exciting discoveries coming out of Iran and will continue then to come out of Iran, we hope, in the future. So first, Egypt; second, Mesopotamia; third, the Elamite or Iranian lands; and fourth, then, if these are the Elamite and Iranian lands, we keep on going east to the Indus Valley civilization, the Indus. This is now largely in the nation state of Pakistan. And you may probably have heard of Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. And here's just to show you some of the artifacts that come out of these sites. These orange stones, we call it carnelian. They called it gug, and they valued this tremendously as a jewel. To us, just a semi-precious stone, but to them, like rubies or diamonds. This comes from Gujarat, and the source then was from the Indus trade, but traded all over through Elam to Babylonia and so forth and so on. So what the Indus people called themselves, we don't know, because though they had writing, we can't read it at all yet. The Babylonians called them Melucha, so I will sometimes call them the Meluchans as well. And we know, though it's very distant, that the Meluchan merchants had gone all the way into Babylonia with their ships from the 23rd and 22nd centuries BC. But by the 21st century BC, it was easier for them simply to dock here or here to go to one of the Gulf trade hubs. The trip from the Indus sites to this area here, the Straits of Hormuz, took between 22 to 50 days of sailing with their maritime technology. The longer the trip back took even longer due to the winds. So I mentioned the Gulf trade hubs. There were two Gulf trade hubs. The first, largely centered at the island of Bahrain, is just to show you what the Souk of Bahrain looks like today and some of the ancient artifacts that we find there. But the one that was used mainly in the 21st century BC, they called it Magan. Today it's Oman, and we see a picture of what Oman looks like today. Oman, as a trade hub, had two advantages. One, it was just a lot closer, especially for the Indus and the Iranian trade. But it also seems to have had a competitive advantage. The people here actually produced copper and they produced stones. So you didn't have to pay for a middleman if you traded in Magan. And that probably accounts for its popularity, in fact, its dominance as a central trading space in the 21st century BC. At this time, they favored sea trade for obvious reasons. It's a lot easier, safer, and cheaper to load a big cargo up once in a ship like this than it is to constantly be loading and reloading a donkey. Now, that's not to say that all trade happened by ship. There was certainly overland trade, as this is trying to indicate. However, in general, the very bulk of the heavy items would go by sea. Now, is this the kind of boat that would travel in the Gulf? This actually is a later boat. We don't have any actual shipwrecks from this time. This is the famous Ulu Burun shipwreck from the 14th century BC, found off the coast of Turkey here. So it's quite a bit later, and it's a different sea. The size of the boat, though, this boat was, I have it written down, yes, it was 15 meters long and 5 meters wide, with a cargo capacity of 20 American tons. Now we know from the texts that the Magan ships were had a cargo capacity of between 16.5 to 33 American tons. We also know that the Magan ships were black from all the waterproofing put on them. Their cargo holds were padded with leather and date palm fronds, and all the ropes were made of goat hair. So those were some features of the boats. Now, as the landscape photos that I'm showing you now, here are the highlands of Iran, southern Iraq, the area around Basra with the date palms, and in Pakistan near the Sindh province. These obviously are very, very, very different regions. What you can grow and produce and get from the ecosystem in one of these regions is just simply not going to be available in the others. So that's like Trade 101. Different regions producing different things then need to trade. We do need to be a little bit careful. 4,000 years have passed. The animals that we have now are not exactly the same as the animals then. The ecosystem is not exactly the same. So we have to be just a little bit careful before we completely retroject back. But I still think that you can see that there's a real ecological incentive for trade. Very, very, very different ecosystems. We also need to think about what's underneath the ground, the stones, the metals, and all the various things like that. Now, this is, of course, the Bronze Age, and bronze being an alloy of copper and either tin, or believe it or not, they often alloyed their copper with arsenic to make something that we call arsenical bronze. So obviously you need those metals. You need copper, you need bronze, you need arsenic. And none of these were available widely in Mesopotamia. So they all had to be imported. Scientific analysis, for instance, of bulls such as this one dug up at Ur in Iraq, has shown that 40% or more of the copper and the bronze that they are using had its source in Oman, in Magan. The source of the tin is still a little up in the air. But as I think you can see from this slide, these aren't like necessary per se. A lot of these are luxury items, right? The beautiful necklace, the carved chlorite bowl. People at that time got status and importance and would show and store their wealth through personal adornments. It was also really important to them to honor their gods and make the shrines and the images of the deities beautiful. And so many of the jewels and vessels and stones would be used for those purposes. And all of this stuff is coming in through the Central Gulf trade hubs. But there are so many more things coming in that we can't dig up, that we can't touch, that we can't see. Many, many organic materials that are now really essentially dust. Textiles were the number1 export, in fact, the #1 industry of Babylonia. And for this period, not a single one of them has survived. Did they necessarily produce carpets? Well, we don't know, but certainly their textiles were very, very, very widely traded. Dates from the region were super important, not just because, let's say you're in Iran and you want something sweet, there aren't going to be date palms necessarily growing there, but also because sugar didn't exist in this part of the world yet. And so if you wanted to sweeten something, date palm syrup, dips, as it's usually called, is going to be your main source. Barley, the main grain, very widely exported. It keeps really well, it stores, and that was a major trading item. As well as this is sesame. Actually, the word sesame was used back then, shegishi, really exactly the same word. And this was very valuable, especially as an oil. So all these things were moving along the trade routes as well, though we can't see them. I do want to emphasize that cloth was the most important export for the Babylonians. And I also just want to note that the scale of this production was almost unimaginably vast. Literally thousands of people were employed making textiles. Women were very heavily involved in all aspects of this manufacture, not just in what are traditional ways that women are involved in getting the wool and spinning it into thread, or as we see this woman from southern Iraq with her loom. This is a traditional South Iraq type of textile, which may possibly look something like what they were making back then. But women actually often were more involved than that. Often women would own the herds of sheep that were producing the wool. Women might supervise work teams of other women. And in some cases, women actually would run the entire textile business. And there were many other things moving along these trade hubs as well. Songs, stories, words, ideas, and also, I fear, domestic rats, which were native to India, but which came on the ships and came to Mesopotamia at this time. Archaeologists have in fact found really major rat infestations in houses in port cities like Ur around this time. I can't even imagine how many rats you have to have for an archaeologist to like dig them up and be able to see them. So that was a less good corollary. But now that the stage is set, let's bring on the players. So as you remember, my postulate number one is, how do you become a successful trader? It's who you know, it's influence. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to a man named Pudu. Pudu. We're going to see his name over and over again. And by the end of this talk, you're going to be able to read it yourself. Pudu was a sea trade merchant from somewhere outside of Babylonia who made it big, becoming not only incredibly wealthy on the copper trade, but even his family marrying into the royal family of Ur. First, let me give you a teeny bit of background about traders at this time. Obviously, there were lots and lots and lots of traders, most conducting just purely domestic trade, like a reed mat maker selling reed mats to somebody who lived down the street, or a man selling ducks in the market. In a sense, these are really what today we would call small business owners. And most of these traders were illiterate and worked without any sort of documentation at all. We do start to get tablets, maybe about 2,000 of them so far, from regional traders called Damgar merchant. The majority of the merchants were men, but women could do this job too. These were people who transferred goods from one city to another and also did quite a lot of money lending on the side. But the most lucrative and economically critical trade was the long distance trade, as we've seen in these large ocean-going boats. Now, these people weren't called Damgar merchant. They had their own title, Gaesh Abba, seafaring merchant. And this seems to have been solely male. No women appear to have done this job. Men from Mesopotamia certainly could be seafaring traders, but very, very often it actually was non-Mesopotamians, men from Iran, from Oman, from Bahrain, and from the Indus were very often the seafaring traders. And sometimes they would come just as far as the trade hub, like from the Indus to the trade hub and back again. But sometimes they would come all the way to Babylonia to trade. There doesn't seem to have been any government impediment to foreigners trading in Mesopotamia. In fact, certain kings bragged about how many foreign merchants thronged their harbors. So Pudu was one of these seafaring traders, and we know of his career because of tablets like this one that span at least 22 years. Pudu's spectacular success made him the study of several previous scholars' work, but new tablets are always coming forth to help us understand even more. Pudu's name marks him as not born in Babylonia, very likely. Unfortunately, we don't know where he came from. My guess is that he came from Magan, or perhaps from this area in here, the southern coast of what is today Iran. And where we first begin to see him, the secret to his success, his breakout moment, if you will, appears to have happened when the king's son, a prince by the name of Shu-Enlil, was sent to be the head general and destroy a place in Iran called Shimashki. Now, just as a side note, this was a terrible idea. They won this war, but they destabilized the region, and about 30 years later, the Shimashkians regrouped and killed them and brought the dynasty down. So, bad idea. But they didn't know that at the time. And so what happens is Shu-Enlil needs to attack Shimashki. Somehow Pudu, the merchant, helps him out. Was it with the ships? Was it with money? Was it with copper for weapons? We don't know. It could have been for all of them. But what we see in this tablet currently in the library, the Free Library of Philadelphia, is Pudu here, coming in at the triumph, when this glorious triumph for the celebration at the court for the destruction of Shimashki is celebrated. Pudu comes first before the prince. And it says when he brought in the Dushia stone, which is that dark stone that I've shown you a couple times. And then comes the prince Shu-Enlil, the son of the king, only after Pudu. So Pudu seems to have made friends with the prince, come to the court for the triumph, and charmed the king, and then able to marry in probably his son, Pudu's son, to the king's daughter, as we saw here, Geminana, the daughter-in-law of Pudu. And Pudu had 2 or 3 sons, 2 of whom became wealthy traders in their own right. One of his sons actually had a second job too, kind of like a side hustle, which was a judge, which is strange, but that's what the texts tell us. So Pudu at this point took on a key role, acquiring copper for the state. He took lots and lots and lots of barley and textiles as payment and supplied copper not just to the central government, but even to local provincial authorities. This new information comes from a tablet from Sulaymaniyah that surfaced just a few years ago. Copper, of course, was vital for tools and weapons. So as to why he got the contracts to supply copper, well, presumably he delivered the goods, but being in with the prince and then his father clearly opened a lot of doors for him. Now here's the part where we talk about the bottom line and added costs like taxes and tolls. In the course of writing my current book on taxes, I've been looking at import-export taxes for businesses like Pudu's, which is not a topic that has received a lot of scholarly attention. But we may wonder, Pudu, really, really rich guy. He has 8 seagoing boats. He employs 360 people just in Babylonia. How much does he pay in taxes? Well, unfortunately, we only have a few very, very small little fragmentary teeny tiny tablets from Ur, as you can see, and this is one of them. And here, this is not Pudu, but his son, Dumu Pudu. Pudu's son is here paying a tithe or tenth, which is the name of a kind of a tax. He's paying 270 large units of barley as a tax. Now, just to put that in context, that's the equivalent of 270 shekels of silver, or 5 months' wages of an average male worker. So this is a really big quantity. And this is the 10th. This is the 10th, right? So obviously, to calculate how much the shipment is that he's paying the tax on, if the tithe is 10%, then we're looking at 10 times that, right? 2,700 gur of barley. And since we know the barley is an export from Mesopotamia, that's what they use to buy the copper. This then seems to be an export tax as the boat leaves the harbor at Ur, or whichever harbor it is, they then take the tax at that point. This is one small tablet. It obviously would be better if we had a lot of tablets, but this is how it's seeming. In terms of import taxes, as the ship is coming in and unloading, we're also expecting that they're going to pay another 10% as they're unloading. We don't have any actual records of that with the name Pudu on it. We have one that doesn't mention a name, which does show a tithe being paid in bronze vessels. So we seem to have 10% going out, 10% coming in. Now, we also would assume that there would be substantial taxes and tolls on the Magan side of the business. Now, you may be wondering why it is that if Pudu has a government contract to supply copper, why the government is really essentially shortchanging themselves by charging themselves taxes. And I have wondered this myself. So there are two possible explanations that come to my mind, at least. The first is just flat, everybody paid taxes, no exceptions. Or the other is, Pudu has 8 boats. Is he really using all of those 8 boats for the government contract? Maybe he's doing some business for himself on the side, and that the taxes then come from the private side of the business. This would really kind of be my guess here, but we really don't necessarily know. Now, while Pudu and his sons are thinking about the bottom line and their profits, international trade was big business all around. When it thrived, the whole economy at home is lifted as well. People were employed, not just those 360 people, but the people supplying the food for the boat, the people making those goat hair ropes, and so forth and so on. So successful trade meant also that the economy had no brakes on it. If you needed to make a plow with copper parts or bronze parts, you could do that. If you needed to roof a building and you needed big timber, that was going ahead. You didn't have to contract and wait for shipments to come in when trade was thriving. So when the import-export business thrived, it brought the whole economy up. And tax revenue, as we've seen plenty of it, was filling the coffers of the government treasury. Since this was an in-kind economy before coinage, if you don't have it, you can't spend it. You can't operate an economy in kind in the red. You also can't store up perishables like barley for more than a few years. So a steady influx of revenue was absolutely critical for their economic stability. Taxes went to build infrastructure, honor the gods, and aid the poor. Merchants, of course, were far less eager to hand over their share of taxes. Human nature being what it is, it seems to have been a fairly universal temptation for some to try to evade paying everything that was due to them. To try to avoid this, the government had a specific profession, the so-called Gulf tax collector. And it seems that sometimes he would wait for the ships at the harbor, maybe at the seaport docks, to make sure there was no funny business. He also collected taxes from the sea fishermen at the same time. Smuggling by docking at a secret harbor wasn't really an option because harbors capable of docking vessels of this size were very few, maybe 2 or 3. But as the 21st century BC waned, ecological collapse and particular salinity problems felled the port cities of Mesopotamia. They could no longer support the export business. Magan also seems to have had problems with its copper supply. We actually have some really vicious customer complaint letters that let us know this. And eventually customers were so unhappy, traders switched to northern sources. The network of formerly profitable trade from Iraq, Iran, the Gulf, the Indus collapsed and withered completely by the 19th century BC. Crises and wars rapidly killed global partnerships. And when people picked up the pieces again, some years later, it was with new partners in Turkey, Syria, and Cyprus. To recap, to establish global trade partnerships in the 21st century BC was not super different from today. You had to have a good product, the ability to make money, peace, and mutual trust. But even back then, who you knew could be as important as whether you were really a good businessman. Contacts at the top could really make or break a shipping career. And even back then, the import-export trade was big business. When trade succeeded, many other sectors of the economy lifted too. But when trade failed, the ripple effect was serious. While our time together today has been brief, a sort of whirlwind introduction to the global trade of the 21st century BC, I hope that you can see that global partnerships and global interconnections are nothing new. Then, as today, we are all linked together. I am now happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Professor Sharlach. And I find it interesting that you're speaking about this, even as global trade has been blocked this week.
The Suez Canal, yeah.
I kind of expected you to throw in a photo of that at some point, but it really does show the centrality of this region for goodness, 4,000 years now for global trade. And you've hit at a number of these questions, but we've had a lot of questions come in while you've been speaking, and just like to ask you to go into a little bit more in depth on some of these. So, for example, we think of in our vantage point now as trade really facilitating this process of globalization, of linking diverse lands and shrinking supply chains and so on and so forth. To what extent in this era that you're referring to, was there a type of proto-globalization? And that has to do with the extent to which, how extensive were the trade networks? Did they break out of that area on the map that you showed us? To what extent did it create sort of a proto-globalization phenomenon?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. The trade networks go all the way into what is today Afghanistan and deep in, although it seems to be sort of like a pass the baton kind of thing. Like from Afghanistan isn't coming all the way to Iraq. It's a little bit more like the Silk Road in that you go from A to B and somebody else goes from B to C and so forth and so on. Yeah, so the trade networks are really extensive, and I think the answer as to like how much contact and how much cultural knowledge there is going to be specific between the various points on the map. So like the answer as to how much contact there is between like Iraq and Iran, there's going to be a lot. I mean, tremendous contact and also barriers because they're not always very friendly with one another at that time, regrettably. But they certainly know a lot about one another. That's going to be obviously more than the trade with the Indus, where you might get like some people from a ship who come and stay, and they have to stay for a while because they have to wait for the winds to go back, right? But there are really, really interesting stories that we see, like literature, or like, for instance, there's quite a lot of what seems to be Mesopotamian astronomy found then in Vedic sources in India. And we think that that actually came then through that time. Unfortunately, the way a lot of this was discussed until fairly recently was a very colonial model. Like the Babylonians were like the British Empire somehow, and like they were the civilized people. And I think they call it like core periphery interaction or whatever. And you read it now and you're like, ugh. But part of that was based on, the time that people were writing. But also because before those places in Iran were literally just found 20 years ago. And before they were found, people were like, oh, well, they must have been primitive or whatever. And then we dig it up and we're like, whoops, really major civilization here. So that's why I find ancient history so exciting, is that we're constantly finding just totally new things.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I find the discussion on 4,000 years ago strangely relevant to today, in terms of thinking about the interaction of trade, governance, cultural innovation, and all these things you've talked about. And I know you've done some work on religion, and so on and so forth, and those issues. One question that did come in that I think is interesting: when we think of contemporary globalization, we think in terms of, in some ways, it weakening local governments or national governments because of the standardization of trade regulations and tariffs and so on and so forth. To what extent did trade in this period, obviously it made a lot of rulers wealthy, but to what extent did it undermine authority or governance structures? Is there any evidence either way on that?
So not from this particular period, but from the period about a century later, there's the archives from this merchants from the city of Ashur. And they then take up the slack once this thing falls out, and they then try to move into Turkey and trade up there. And they actually, the merchants are the ones who are negotiating the treaties with the foreign powers, not the king. So the merchants really seem to have kind of the king over a barrel in a way. And they seem to be much more powerful. There's nothing from this early period that would suggest that. I think the king knew what he was doing when he married his daughter to this guy, right? I want copper. I'm sending her to Magan, and she's watching you. You know what I mean? Because I think that's what the kings would do with the princesses, is they would marry them off to foreign lands, and so that woman then was the eyes and ears of the king, and made sure that everything worked well, or she would write a letter, or have someone write a letter for her if she were illiterate. We don't have a lot of information, but I think in this early period, the kings are pretty much in control. And then as things fall apart, the kings just really lose it and are weak, and the merchants are actually much more powerful.
That's interesting. So the next question that's come in is related, and maybe you just want to expand on a little bit. But the question that's come in is: are there any texts that show official trade partnerships between nations, or was it really handled at the merchant level? Was there a political mechanism for this, or was it really just the individual traders who were running it?
I think one doesn't want to modernize too much, but if you think about how that works today, it kind of works at both levels in a way. Two governments would agree, okay, These are the tariffs that we're going to put or not put, and this is what's going to happen if one of our traders gets in trouble or something like that, right? But then it's really kind of up to the individual people, the individual firms to negotiate what they're doing. And so that seems to kind of be similar back then. We do actually have one treaty, which was negotiated between a king of the Sargonic period, it doesn't matter. Anyway, around 2200 BC, with the king of Iran. He went to Susa to do this. And they specify if your trader is killed, then we will extradite. We will make every effort for safe trade. So there is that very, very, very high level government protection. But I think if you're just an actual guy who's trying to sell 50 cloths, I don't think, as long as you're paying your taxes and you're not trading illegally, then I don't think they want to have too much to do with that.
Okay. I'm thinking of a passage that I read some time ago about a period later in Palestine, where not too much later in this period, but the trade in iron and iron working and forming of plows and swords was literally prohibited for the Israelites, right? So their enemies wanted to keep this trade so that the Israelites could not oppose them. Other examples in this period you're looking at in time frame of prohibited trade, where we don't want you to trade this thing with those people. Embargo.
Yeah. So this is the Bronze Age, but there are bits of iron that do fall from the sky in meteors. We call that meteoric iron. And those same traders a little bit later are actually prohibited from trading in meteoric iron. And they do it anyway, and one of them gets thrown in jail, and it's this whole big story. There are certain things that I'm sure were prohibited, but because the records we have are the records of I put this in the boat, we don't specifically have any prohibitions at this time.
Okay. Good. Yeah, I think thinking about the technology available at the time and the materials available at the time and all the diverse uses you can put those technologies to, it's really instructive for us. And of course, we're still dealing with many of the same issues today as we think about fissile material or certain advanced technologies or even AI. Don't trade this with those groups of people. It really becomes a very important geopolitical issue. A question that's come in really has to what extent, how was trade regulated? Was it more or less open, or was it all just on whatever this particular local leader says is going to happen? There are no, for example, based on what I think you've said so far, there's no agreements saying we will trade these things, but we won't trade these things, or so regulation can happen at that kind of level, or it could happen at the tariff level or the tax level. How formalized was that, I guess, is really the question I'm trying to get at.
Their economy was, the king liked to think that he had like kind of a lockdown on it. And you can sort of look at parallels to the Ottoman Empire, where the king wants to, for instance, cap prices of goods so that people don't get gouged. The Romans would do this too. Like, you set a maximum price for grain. It's not particularly cheap. Like, so you could get grain for less in the market, but you say, look, like it might be electricity in Texas or whatever. Like, your electricity bill cannot be more than like $900 a month or whatever it is, right? So kings would try to set equivalences, like it's always going to be, you can get this much barley for this much silver, and that's going to be the maximum. And we're not going to allow people to gouge you and so forth and so on. So they definitely tried to cap prices, and that would occur for the traders as well, right? And that definitely is going to cut into their bottom line and their profits, because they're already paying, all these taxes and tolls. as they come in and they go out and all these things. But there are a couple of places where the kings will specifically say, I encourage people to come and trade here. I brought all these foreigners in to trade here. So they're deliberately like seeking people to come in, but they don't seem to have, for instance, like there's no evidence you had to have a permit or anything like to come and trade. I think you could kind of just show up, but their economy was very traditional, right? So like it wouldn't be that you just show up and can do business, right? You would come with your father as you're growing up, and then as you come, then it would be you who would come, and they would know you, and they would know your product, and they would know you're coming back next year. And otherwise it's dead, because if you just show up and you're like, hey, I've got some great ore, and they put it in the furnace and it is just a rock, then it's not good for anyone.
Right. So it's very personalized. I think you led off with that it's very personalized. And towards the end of your talk, you mentioned how due to a variety of circumstances, these trade relationships began to break down, and people began to trade elsewhere, with Turkey or other regions. How long did it take before this region really became a trade bloc again, or where?
So if you look in the kind of medieval period, Oman is taking a very similar role again, and then unfortunately they get kind of trashed by the Portuguese and other unpleasant, like slave trade stuff happens there. But really the ecological collapse as a result of the salinity, because they're really basically like true southern ports, and they were trading barley. But when your barley crop dies a death, that region really actually does not come back at all, even to this day. If you look at Iraq, that part of Iraq today, it's just dry. So that particular trade doesn't really come back at all.
Were these regions eventually incorporated into the Silk Road?
The Silk Road or Silk Roads, or sometimes people like to call it the Spice Roads, that, as you know, comes with Han China and the Romans, and is later, and really is pushing very different products. Now, Baghdad will be a stop on the Silk Road, but and strangely, actually, nobody thought that they had spices really at this point, like that kind of spices. But an archaeologist fairly recently at a site on the Euphrates in Turkey found actually a whole bag of cloves at this time. We're like, what? Where did those come from? So they're coming from somewhere. But the Silk Road is really different, really late, and different products. But the northern parts of Iraq will come into that region.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for such an interesting talk. And it's amazing to me when we think about the impact again of trade on the geopolitics of the region and on the ideological innovation and the other sorts of social innovation. So we're very, very grateful for your talk today and appreciate it. I would like to let everybody know that if you would like more information about the Iranian and Persian Gulf Studies program at Oklahoma State, please check it out at global.okstate.edu, and you'll find a link to the IPGS program there. As a reminder, all of the presentations for this week, including today's, will remain accessible at OState TV for later viewing in case you missed any of them. And if you did, I really do hope you go back and take a look at them. Every one of them was fascinating. I would also like to thank the staff of the Institute for Teaching and Learning Excellence and OState TV for hosting our event this week. And most of all, just thank you, Professor Sharlach, for a fascinating talk. Thanks to all of our audience, and we appreciate your being here this evening. Good night.